So the most famous art that people probably think of from Harlem is poetry. Like, right, you have Langston Hughes, um, and his very famous poetry, um, "Dreamer," "Let America Be America." All of these really beautiful, amazing poems. But you also have many other poets. For example, Claude McKay, um, and his work, "Songs of Jamaica," really celebrated Black peasant life in Jamaica, and his book Consta Ballads discussed hardship faced by many poor blacks in urban centers of Jamaica, like Kingston. So he really focused on his personal heritage, I believe, as a Jamaican, like, and his Jamaican heritage. James Weldon Johnson wrote 50 Years and Other Poems, and he wrote on a range of topics from, the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation to lynchings. And Georgia Douglas Johnson wrote Bronze, and explored motherhood and what it meant to be a woman of color. So all of these really focused on identity, and you can see that as a thread throughout the Harlem Renaissance because it was an explosion of black art for black people. Like, the art made here was spread throughout um, northern centers of black and African American culture, and it was also spread throughout parts of the South. Finally, we have music. So during this time period, jazz music began to be really popular, and um, it's a form of music invented by Black people and rooted heavily in African American culture. So, two of the most famous blues and jazz singers during this time period were Ma Rainey. She was known as the mother of the blues, and she was known for singing about sexuality and the day to day lives of Black people in the South. And her protege, Bessie Smith, dubbed by the press as the Empress of the Blues, and she sang about life as a working class woman, stressing independence, fearlessness, and sexual freedom. So these were two of the most famous blues singers of the time period, and there were also many prominent jazz artists. So the Cotton Club, which you can see a picture of on the left, was a prominent jazz club in Harlem, and it really started the careers of many famous jazz musicians like Duke Ellington and his band. And as you can see, Cab Calloway is playing in the Cotton Club that night in this photograph, and he was also another very famous jazz artist. So the Cotton Club was really, really important because it served as a place for black music um, to be spread to white society, which really allowed it this huge hold on American culture. So white patrons would usually avoid Harlem, but they would come to the Cotton Club as tourists, and they would watch the jazz musicians perform. So the Cotton Club obviously was geared towards these white audience members rather than the black performers. One of the main ways you can see this is the name, the Cotton Club, which encouraged people to like think of slavery and cotton picking, and the fact that the Cotton Club was eventually run by white owners. Additionally, black musicians weren't paid that well, including famous names such as Duke Ellington, as well as less famous ones. So, uh, throughout the Harlem Renaissance, towards the end of it, people actually started to avoid the Cotton Club because they saw it as just another way for white people to exploit them. So, I just want to end off with this little exit slip. So, I want you to think about what common themes do you see across these artists' work? Why do you think they might have focused on those themes? How do you think this affected white views of black culture? And how does the treatment of black culture and black people differ from the treatment of white people and white culture? So just pause the video for a second and just think about these questions. Okay, So, before we start, I just want to point out this picture in the background. This right here is Duke Ellington at the piano and his band in the background. So, across these artists' work, the most obvious theme we can see is identity. And that's Black identity for female writers and artists. It's Black women's identity. And the themes you can see are just the legacy of slavery and racism and grappling with that, but also a celebration of Black ingenuity, Black creativity, Black culture. So it's this combination of grappling with a difficult past and celebrating everything people have done throughout time, really, and celebrating the Black culture that has never been celebrated before. So why do you think they might have focused on those themes? Well, personally, I think it's just those are like the themes that are most important to them, celebrating something that's close to them but hasn't necessarily been celebrated properly before. So, how do I think this affected white views of Black culture? Well, as we saw with the Cotton Club, white people enjoyed commodifying these aspects of Black culture, and they enjoyed having it sort of created for them. So they liked jazz musicians and they liked artists who focused on pacifying white people, sort of. So they enjoyed jazz music because they were able to separate the critical aspect of Black culture from it. They were able to say, oh, it's just music, it doesn't really matter, and they could avoid thinking about the legacy and the history behind it. Meanwhile, you couldn't do the same thing with Black writing or sculpture or art because it was physically there. It was visible to them and they couldn't just delete it from their view. So it so that's why you can really see that until recently Black writers and poets and artists were ignored while jazz music literally defined America for the 20th century if you think about the Roaring 20s because they were able to separate that aspect that they didn't like from it. So, how does the treatment of Black culture and Black people differ from white people and white culture? As we've seen, white culture didn't have to be palatable to Black people. It didn't even have to be palatable to the majority of white people. As long as it was white, people respected it because they saw it as superior and better. Meanwhile, Black culture constantly had to play respectability politics in order to be respected by the greater society. So, as you can see, no matter what, there was always this undertone of respectability that was forced onto Black people and their culture, which meant that if they wanted if they wanted white patrons, they had to play those respectability politics. And as we'll see, this developed um, further, and it really encouraged a lot of what we see in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, all the way up to the civil rights movement, because you have those same respectability politics come into play where Black people would try to prove themselves as patriotic. And you have those same ideas with Booker T. Washington saying, try to be the best you can be, and then white people will respect us. It's that idea that you have to change yourself for the majority to accept you. And it's understandable that people will want to do that because ultimately, acceptance is what we all as humans crave. But ultimately, as we get into the civil rights movement, people start to fight back against that idea, saying, why do I have to make myself more acceptable for white people when they've never done the same for us? So just when you're enjoying art and music, just think about these undertones and the history behind it, because no matter what, history always plays an important part into context and understanding why something happened. Thank you so much for joining me today. As usual, I will link some primary sources in the description, and I'll see you again later.